Okay, so it's 1852 in Lower Bengal, and you need work that pays. You have land. Maybe 3 acres, maybe 5, and the best of it sits where the water drains properly after the rains. That's your good field. In March, a man walks into the village. He isn't a buyer. He works for a factory 8 miles off, the kind with brick tanks sunk into the ground, and he carries a bag of coin and a book. He writes your name in the book before anything is in the soil. You've been past that factory. You can smell it from the road, because fermenting indigo leaf smells like a pond that has turned, and the smell holds in cloth for weeks. The men who work those tanks have hands the color of a bruise. It doesn't wash off. It wears off, over months. None of that is the part that decides your year. The part that decides your year is the book, the coin, and the timing. So the question worth 20-odd minutes is a simple one. What is this job actually paying you for? Here's the version everyone knows. Indigo was one of the most valuable things shipped out of India in the 19th century. Blue was hard to get, and it didn't fade, so European mills paid for it, and the trade ran on that fact for generations. The figures seem to agree. As late as 1897, refined indigo was still fetching somewhere around 7 to 8 shillings a pound, and commonly cited figures put the area under indigo in British India at close to 1.7 million acres in 1895. That isn't a niche crop. That's an industrial input grown across a landmass. Here's the problem. Both of those numbers belong to somebody else. Shillings a pound is a price recorded at the far end of the chain, after leaf became cake, and cake crossed an ocean. Acreage is a figure an administration collected. Neither one is a line in the ledger of the household whose good field is inside it. So the level has to come down. Come down a level, and the shape of the job changes. Because the money doesn't arrive when the crop is sold. It arrives in March, from the man with the book, and it arrives whether the season ahead turns out well or badly. Which means the transaction that decides your year has already closed before a single plant is above the soil. The harvest is only delivery on a deal made months earlier. So the accurate description of this job isn't farmer. You're not growing a dye. You're servicing a loan that gets renewed every planting season. Everything after this is the arithmetic of that sentence. Of the 5 ways a profession dies, this one dies the first way. Machine substitution. Machine in the sense that matters to a ledger, which means a production process that makes the identical output at a lower marginal cost. The tell is always the same. There's a year when the price of the thing the job produces falls straight down. That year exists here, and it's coming. Hold that thought, because the interesting question comes first. Why did this job exist at all? Start with the demand, because the demand was real. European textile mills were scaling through the middle of the century, and a mill needs color that survives washing. Most colors available then didn't. Blue that held was the exception, and the molecule that delivered it came out of a plant. There was no other route to it. Not an expensive route, not a slow route, none. Now the awkward part of that plant. Indigofera doesn't contain blue. It contains a colorless precursor sitting inside the leaf. And getting from one to the other means cutting the plant, steeping it in water until it ferments, beating the liquid with air, letting the sediment drop, then pressing and drying what settles. Miss the window, and you get sludge worth nothing. That sequence dictates everything about the economics. Because fermentation starts on its own schedule, cut leaf can't travel far and can't wait. So the processing tanks have to sit near the fields. Because the tanks are fixed capital in brick, whoever builds them needs guaranteed leaf arriving on a predictable date across a wide area. And because the plant wants the same drainage and the same season as the food crop, the land it needs is the good land. In the months the good land is most wanted. So the constraint isn't botanical. It's scheduling. A factory owner can't buy leaf on a spot market, because no spot market can exist for a good that spoils in a day. He has to contract the supply before it grows. That's the whole reason the advance exists. The money handed over in March isn't generosity, And it isn't a wage. It's a procurement instrument. And it solves the factory's problem completely. It locks acreage, delivery date, and price in one motion, months before anyone knows what the season will do. Who paid for it? Ultimately the mill in Europe, then the shipper, then the factory. The advance was the last link, and it was the cheapest link to control. So far, so good. Now, who actually held the shovel? There wasn't one kind of indigo cultivator. There were at least 4, and they sat at different distances from the ledger. First, the household farming factory held land directly. In the records, this arrangement gets called niche cultivation. The factory controls the plot, the household supplies labor on it, and the relationship is closer to hired work than to farming. Small share of total production, and the least interesting economically, because there's no illusion of ownership to lose. Second, and this is the large one, the household farming its own land under an advance contract. Records call this the Rioti arrangement. You keep your land, you keep your tenancy, you keep the risk. What you've sold is a claim on your next season, and you sold it in March for coin in hand. Most of the people in this story are here. When the arithmetic comes later, this is the tier being counted. Third, the household with genuinely good land, which turns out to be a worse position than it sounds. Because if your field drains well, your field is the one the factory wants, and the obligation attaches to the best fraction of your holding rather than the spare corner. In the Bihar districts, this hardened into a stated ratio, described in later accounts as roughly 3 parts in 20 of the holding committed to indigo. Set aside the exact fraction. The structural point is that the share taken wasn't random, and it wasn't the marginal land. Fourth, the village intermediary who guaranteed the advances. He isn't a cultivator, but he's inside the mechanism, because somebody local had to stand behind the book. He carried collection risk, and he took a margin for it, which means he had reasons of his own to want the contracts renewed. 4 tiers, 1 document connecting them. And the document is where the cost sits. Which brings up the obvious question: what did it cost to get into this line of work? Nothing. There's no apprenticeship, no tools to buy, no guild to join. Anyone with land and a season could start tomorrow. Which is exactly why the cost isn't at the entrance. It's on the way out. Count what a season under contract actually consumed. The good field, first, for the months it mattered. Not a corner of the holding. The part with drainage, in the window when drainage decides whether food grows. Then the inputs that follow the field. Draft animals, manure, the household's own labor hours, all directed into a plant nobody in the household can eat. That's not a small reallocation. It's the reallocation of the entire productive capacity of the farm toward an output with exactly 1 buyer. Then the deductions at delivery. Leaf was weighed and assessed for quality at the factory, and the sum credited against your advance depended on that assessment. Short wait, weak leaf, late arrival. Each one shrank the credit. The obligation didn't shrink with it. And then there's the item almost nobody accounts for. The balance didn't end with the season. If the credited value of your delivery came in under the advance you'd taken, the shortfall carried forward. Next March, the man with the book arrives, and the new advance opens against an existing balance. The contract renews on top of itself. Records from the period indicate these balances also attached to the land and followed the household across generations, which means the obligation could outlive the person who accepted it and land on whoever inherited the field. Read that as a piece of financial engineering rather than a hardship, because that's what it is. A liability with no maturity date, secured against the productive asset, renewed annually by the creditor's own agent, denominated in a good the creditor weighs and grades himself. Entry cost, 0. Exit cost, undefined. Now, here's where it breaks down. Pick 1. 2 households, same district, same year, same contract. The first gets a good indigo season, heavy leaf, clean fermentation, full delivery. The second gets a bad one. Thin leaf, a bad steep, half the expected yield. At the end of the year, Which household's balance in the book looks worse? Take the obvious answer. The bad season, clearly. Less delivered, less credited, bigger shortfall carried forward. Now the actual answer. Over the run of years, the gap between those two households is far smaller than the gap between their harvests, and in a good many cases it rounds to nothing at all. Let that sit for a second. Here's why, and it has nothing to do with luck. Look at what was fixed in March and what was left floating. Fixed. The acreage committed, the delivery obligation, and the rate at which delivered leaf would be credited. Floating. How much leaf the season produced, and what the finished dye eventually sold for in Europe. Notice who holds which. The household holds the floating item that can only hurt it. Yield risk sits entirely on the field. If the season disappoints, the shortfall is the household's shortfall. But the household holds no share of the floating item that could help it. If the finished cake sells high that year in a European port, the credit rate written in March doesn't move. There's no upside participation, because the price wasn't a price, it was a term. So a good season doesn't pay a good season return. It pays the March rate, times more units, minus whatever the assessment takes off. And a bad season doesn't produce a bad season loss. It produces a carried balance, which is a claim on next March. That's the mechanism. Upside capped by contract, downside converted into debt, and debt converted into a renewed contract. Run that loop for 5 seasons, and the household's position depends almost entirely on the terms, and almost not at all on the farming. Which reverses the thing everyone assumes about agriculture. Normally the weather is the variable that matters most. Under an advance contract, it's one of the variables that matters least, because it was priced out of the household's control before it happened. And once you see that, 3 questions become the only questions worth asking. Who sets the rate? Who operates the scale? Who keeps the book? The answer to all 3 was the same party. Now the other side of the ledger. Follow the money the long way, from the port back to the field. At the top, a European mill buying refined dye by weight, caring about one thing: color strength per unit, because that's what determines how much dye a batch of cloth consumes. Below that, an export merchant at Calcutta, buying pressed cake, financing shipment, carrying price risk between purchase and sale, real risk, and a real margin for it. Below that, the factory. This is the tier holding the fixed capital, the brick tanks, the presses, the drying sheds, and the tier with the scheduling problem described earlier. Its margin comes from the spread between the cost of leaf delivered to its tanks and the price of cake leaving its yard. Below that, the village intermediary standing behind the advances, taking a slice for collection risk. And at the bottom, the household, which supplied the land, the labor, the animals, the manure and the timing, and absorbed the yield risk. 4 tiers of margin above the 1 tier carrying the production risk. That's the structure, and it isn't unusual. What's unusual is the instrument holding it together, because the advance did something a wage never does. A wage is a cost the employer pays. An advance becomes an asset on the payer's books the moment it's handed over. The factory didn't spend that money, it placed it. And the legal ground under this was written down, which is the part that makes it a system rather than a habit. Bengal had a statute governing indigo contracts dating from 1836, which gave the arrangement a legal frame in the first place. Then, after the cultivation refusals that spread across Bengal districts in 1859 and 1860, a further measure was passed, Act 11 of 1860, which for a limited period made breach of an indigo contract a criminal matter rather than a civil one. That distinction is the whole ballgame. A civil obligation is a claim on your assets. A criminal one is a claim on your body. Convert one into the other, and the creditor no longer needs to price default risk, because default stops being an economic decision. The refusals of 1859 and 60 were organized and widespread, and the administration's response included appointing a formal commission of inquiry, the Indigo Commission of 1860, Its report is the official record on this, and it concluded that the cultivation had involved coercion, including compelling cultivators to accept advances. That's the finding of the inquiry, in its own year, and it's the only basis on which any of this gets characterized here. The advances continued after it. The instrument was too useful to the tier above to abandon. And then there's a detail in the delivery process that is small, specific, and does more work than any of the above. Cut indigo can't wait. Fermentation begins on the plant's timetable, not the seller's. Once the crop is cut, the clock is running in hours, not days. So the leaf goes to the nearest tanks immediately, because the nearest tanks are the only tanks reachable before the material degrades. Which means the weighing and the quality assessment happened at the factory, performed by the buyer, on goods that could not be taken anywhere else and could not be taken home again. There's no shopping the load. There's no waiting for a better rate next week. There's no second buyer 8 miles further on, because 8 miles further on is too far. The seller stands next to a pile of material that is losing value by the hour, in a yard belonging to the only party who can use it, while that party writes down what it weighs and what it's worth. Records of the period indicate assessments frequently came in below what cultivators expected. They would. By the middle of the 1890s, this looks less like a trade and more like permanent infrastructure. Commonly cited figures put the area under indigo in British India at close to 1.7 million acres in 1895. Factories across Bengal and Bihar, an export chain through Calcutta, contracts renewing every March, and a legal frame decades old. In 1897, refined indigo was still going at something around 7 to 8 shillings a pound. Nothing in those numbers says ending. The signal wasn't in those numbers. It had been sitting in European chemistry journals for over a decade. German laboratories had been working on the indigo molecule since the 1880s. The structure was published. Synthetic routes were demonstrated. And for years none of it mattered commercially, because a laboratory synthesis and an industrial process are different animals, and the early routes cost far more per pound than a field in Bihar. So the demonstrations were noted and filed, which was a reasonable response. Every one of those early syntheses lost money. In 1897, one of them stopped losing money. Bass brought a commercial synthetic indigo to market that year, according to the company's own history of itself. Now, why it won. And this is the part that gets told wrong almost every time. It didn't win because it was chemically cleverer. A dyer doesn't care where a molecule was assembled. It won on 4 cost lines, and each one maps directly onto a constraint from earlier in this episode. Line 1, land. Synthetic production consumed no acreage, 0. The single largest input to natural indigo, well-drained agricultural land in the growing season, dropped out of the cost structure completely. Line 2, timing. A plant yields once a year, on the season's schedule. A reactor yields on the operator's schedule, in winter, in a drought year. Which means the entire scheduling problem that the advance contract existed to solve simply vanished. No advances, no acreage locking, no delivery windows, no intermediaries, no carried balances. That whole financial apparatus was overhead, and the new process didn't need any of it. Line 3, and this is the one that hit hardest, purity. Natural indigo cake was a variable product. Color strength per pound moved with the season, the soil, the steep, the vat. So a mill had to test each batch and dose against the weakest assumption, which means paying for weight that wasn't doing work. Synthetic material came in at consistent strength, batch after batch. So a mill needed fewer pounds for the same cloth, and scrapped fewer runs. Look at what that does. It means the two products were never competing at the same price per pound. A pound of consistent, high-strength dye replaced more than a pound of variable dye, because it did more work per pound in the vat. So the gap in the shilling price understates the gap in the cost per yard of cloth dyed. Line 4, learning curve. A chemical process gets cheaper as the plant is optimized. A field doesn't, or not at that rate. So the price gap widened every year on its own. The response from the natural side was serious and well-funded. From 1898 to 1913, a research program ran through colonial and imperial laboratories with a defined objective: raise the dye yield per acre, and raise the purity of natural indigo enough to hold the market. Better varieties, and better extraction from the same leaf. It produced real science. It did not change the outcome. Because the program was attacking lines 3 and 4 while lines 1 and 2 were untouchable. You can improve a plant's yield. You cannot make a plant stop needing land, and you cannot make it stop needing a season. The area under indigo, close to 1.7 million acres in 1895, had come down to under 150,000 acres by the early 1910s. The price that stood at 7 to 8 shillings a pound in 1897 had fallen well below that over the same stretch. Roughly a decade and a half, and the acreage was down by more than 9/10. Now the arithmetic. And before any of it, 3 things have to be on the table, because without them the numbers are theater. 1. This is the Rioti tier. Household on its own land, under an advance contract. The large group, not the top of the ladder. 2. This is the nominal advance minus deductions that are documented, and there are deductions that aren't quantifiable at all, so treat every figure here as generous to the contract. 3. No day rate multiplication happens here, because labor days aren't the real cost. The real cost is the food crop that didn't get planted. So do it in rice. Under company administration through roughly 1800 to 1858, the price of rice in Bengal generally sat in the range of 40 to 50 kilograms per rupee. Gazetteer figures for the period put a field laborer's day at a few pence. Hold both. Now the household. The good fraction of the holding goes to indigo for the main season. Call it the difference between a household with a full food crop and a household with a partial one. That gap has to be bought back in the market, at market prices, in the months after harvest when a household short of grain is buying, and everyone else is too. And the advance was received in March, spent by June, because that's what a household short of grain does with coin in March. So the sequence is this: take coin in spring, forgo food in autumn, buy grain in winter at whatever the market asks, and arrive at next March with a balance in the book. So call the job what it is: a household converting its own food security into a short-term cash advance, once a year, at a rate it doesn't set. The plant is finished. The position isn't. Because the thing that died in 1913 was a crop. What the crop was carrying was a financing structure, and that structure had nothing to do with botany. Strip out the leaf and the tanks, and what's left is a template with 4 moving parts: a buyer with fixed capital and a scheduling problem, a supplier too small to hold inventory or shop the load, money moving from buyer to supplier before production, and a settlement performed by the buyer, in the buyer's yard, on the buyer's scale. Every one of those parts is still in service. You find it wherever a processor funds a season's inputs and takes delivery at a rate agreed before planting. You find it in supply agreements where the purchaser advances tooling or materials and recovers the value against future deliveries. You find it in equipment financing recovered by deduction from earnings, where the entity setting the deduction is also the entity assigning the work. None of those are the same industry, they're the same instrument. And the reason the instrument survives isn't cunning. It survives because it solves a real problem, exactly as it did in Bengal. Small suppliers are capital-starved, and buyers need certainty. The advance genuinely delivers both. What it also does, every time, is move the pricing decision to the moment of maximum information asymmetry, and move the settlement to the party holding the scale. That's a structural property rather than a moral one, and it holds regardless of who is standing on either side. The acreage is gone, the clause is not. So run the counterfactual, because there's exactly one variable that had to move. Not the law, not the commission, not the price of a pound. Dye yield per acre. That's it. The program that ran from 1898 to 1913 was aiming at precisely that number, and it was aiming at it for a reason. Enough color strength out of each acre, and the land line and the season line stop being disqualifying, because a small enough area of land generates a large enough volume of dye to compete with a reactor. How far away was it? Far enough that 15 years of directed research with laboratory backing on both sides of the empire didn't close it. The gap wasn't a few percent. It was the difference between a process bounded by photosynthesis and a process bounded by throughput. That was never going to be a close race. It was only ever a question of what year the loser found out. Which brings this back to March, and the man with the book. He was never buying leaf. He was buying the right to price your entire season before your season existed, and he was paying for that right with money you needed too badly to negotiate over. You weren't growing a dye. You were servicing a loan that got renewed every planting season. The households in this story read their situation correctly. They knew what the contract cost them. What they couldn't see from a field in Bihar was that a laboratory 2 continents away was about to make the buyer's problem disappear, and with it, the buyer's reason to keep them. So the question isn't whether your job is safe. The question is, which of the 5 ways this ends applies to you, and whether the price of what you produce is set by you or by whoever paid you first.